March 1945, Bavaria. The war had not ended, but for the women held in a small American-administered labor detachment outside a farming town near the Danube, the war had already moved somewhere else, somewhere they could still hear but no longer see. What remained for them was work. Prisoner labor was standard practice under the Geneva Convention, and by early 1945, the American zone was full of small agricultural details. Groups of 10 or 20 women marched out each morning to plant, dig, or clear fields that German men could no longer tend because German men were dead, captured, or still fighting somewhere east of the Rhine. The women in this detachment had been auxiliary personnel, a mix of former Luftwaffe helpers, telephone operators, and a few younger conscripts pulled from finishing school into uniform sometime in 1944. None of them had farmed before. Most had never held a hoe, but the American quartermaster in charge of the district needed the fields worked, and prisoner labor was cheap, available, and by the rules of war, entirely legal to use. The winter had been long and vicious even by Bavarian standards. Snow had fallen late into February, and when it stopped, the ground beneath it had frozen down several inches, hard as poured concrete. The thaw was supposed to start by the second week of March. It did not. A cold snap rolled back through the valley, and the topsoil that should have softened stayed locked solid. On the morning in question, the women were marched out as usual, under guard, to a field on the edge of town meant to be planted with early potatoes. The guards, a squad of American infantrymen, pulled off the line for garrison duty while they recovered from frostbite of their own. Expected the same routine as every other morning. Line the women up, hand out tools, watch the clock. It did not take long for the problem to surface. The lead woman in the group, a former telephone operator named Ilse, who had picked up enough broken English to serve as an informal go-between, drove a spade into the ground, and it bounced back as though she had struck stone. She tried again a few feet over. Same result. Up and down the line, the other women tested the same way, and the same thing happened every time. The frost had not broken. The field was unworkable. Ilse looked at the corporal supervising the detail, a soldier from Nebraska named Russo, who had been in the war 4 months and had spent most of that time being told exactly what German prisoners would try to get away with. She said the only English phrase that fit, one she had rehearsed the night before because the women had already suspected this would happen. We couldn't work the frozen fields today. It was, by any measure, an ordinary sentence. But for Ilse, it was closer to an act of defiance than anything she had said in uniform. She had spent 4 years being taught that a soldier does not explain herself to a superior, only obeys, and that a prisoner explaining herself to an enemy was worse still, a request dressed up as an excuse, exactly the kind of thing that got you marked as difficult. She had never once, in her entire service, spoken to an officer about what she could or could not do. She had simply done it, or failed, and taken the consequences quietly. Standing in that field, she fully expected the consequences to start now. Russo walked over and looked down at the spade marks in the dirt. He crouched, the way soldiers do when they want to check something for themselves, rather than take a prisoner's word for it, and drove his own boot heel into the ground. It barely left a mark. He tried a spade next and got the same bounce Ilse had gotten. He stood back up, looked out across the field, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to his men and told them to stand the detail down. No work today. Back to the barn. The women did not move at first, unsure they had heard the translation right. One of the younger prisoners, barely out of her teens, began to cry, not from relief exactly, but from the strange vertigo of being told that a problem she had expected to be punished for was simply being treated as a fact about the weather. Rather than march them straight back to the cold holding barn, Russo radioed the command post to explain the situation. The reply left him discretion, provided the women stayed under guard and returned to duty the moment the ground allowed it. He used that discretion generously, marching the detail instead to a requisitioned schoolhouse the company had been using for storage, one with a working stove and enough firewood stacked against the wall to last the week. It was there, waiting for the stove to catch, that Ilse asked for something a second time. Word had reached the detachment days earlier that mail from a nearby processing camp had finally started moving. Letters from other captured women who had been separated from this group back in February. Ilse asked Russo, through gestures and the little English she had, whether the details' names could be added to that list, whether anyone might tell them if their letters home had gone anywhere at all. It was a bigger ask than the first one. Nobody had told her prisoners were allowed to request such a thing. She braced again, this time for the flat refusal she assumed was coming. The reminder that she was a captive making demands, not a citizen making requests. Russo did not promise anything. He said only that he would ask. 3 days later, a runner came through with a list of names for the mail unit, and hers was on it. Some of the women who heard about that exchange later said it unsettled them more than the frozen field had. Being told no work today was a mercy handed down. Asking after your own letters, and having someone simply say he'd look into it, felt like being treated as a person with standing to ask questions in the first place. And that was a stranger thing to sit with than kindness alone. The women spent that first afternoon indoors, out of the wind, while guards took turns feeding the stove. It was not comfort in any real sense. The building was still cold, rations still thin, guards still watching the door. But it was the first full day indoors in daylight hours any of them had had since capture. And for women who had marched through snow for weeks, a roof and a fire were close to luxury. Around midday, the company cook arrived with a pot of soup meant for the guards' own lunch and split it between soldiers and prisoners without comment. It was thin, mostly potato and barley, but hot, and no one explained why it appeared. It simply had. By afternoon, several guards, bored with watching a room of women mend coats and talk quietly, did what soldiers with nothing else to do have always done. They talked. A private from Texas tried out a handful of German phrases picked up from a grandmother back home and got laughter in return, the first laughter some of the guards had heard from the detail since it arrived. The tension that had defined every earlier encounter eased, not disappeared, but eased, the way ice eases before it actually breaks. It took 3 more days before the soil softened enough to plant. For those 3 days, the detail worked half shifts indoors, mending tools and sorting seed potatoes by hand, technically employed without needing frozen ground to cooperate. None of it made an after-action report. What survived was smaller than that, carried only in memory, and told decades later in a handful of post-war interviews. What the women remembered was not the soup or the stove. It was the moment Ilse said the ground could not be worked, and the moment after that when she asked about the mail, and both times braced for punishment that never came. A corporal from Nebraska had checked the frozen dirt himself instead of assuming she was lying, and had promised nothing more than that he would ask, and then had actually asked. For women raised to believe that a captive who spoke up was a captive courting trouble, it was the first sign that the war they feared might not run on the rules they'd been given. If you found this story worth remembering, consider subscribing so these moments aren't lost to time. Like the video to help it reach more people, and comment below. Do you think a prisoner of war should have been able to ask for something like that at all? Or did Ilse push her luck further than she should have?